3 months after a global electromagnetic collapse shuts down modern civilization, the town of Greyhaven has barely survived the brutal winter. Now nearby settlements are emerging from the chaos, forcing Greyhaven to choose between building alliances or expanding power. This is City of Static, Book 3, Ash and Iron. Winter had not ended, but it had stopped winning. 3 months earlier, the electromagnetic cascade that silenced the world had reduced modern civilization to scattered islands of survival. Cities went dark, governments disappeared, supply chains collapsed. Greyhaven endured. Through rationing, through bitter cold, through fear that almost tore the town apart. But something unexpected had happened during the long winter. Greyhaven had changed. It was no longer simply a town. It was becoming a system. And systems attract attention. Because beyond the forests and frozen lakes of northern Ontario, other communities were still struggling to survive. Some were desperate. Some were angry. And some were already beginning to look at Greyhaven as something more than a neighbor. Something worth claiming. Part 1. The End of the Worst. The ice on Lake Grey cracked for the first time in late March. It began with a deep sound that echoed across the frozen water like distant thunder. Then a thin fracture appeared along the surface, stretching outward in a crooked line that glimmered under pale sunlight. People stopped to watch. For the first time in months, the town felt something close to relief. Spring was not here yet, but winter had begun to loosen its grip. Mayor Eleanor Vale stood on the shoreline with Malcolm Reed beside her, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. "That sound might be the most beautiful thing I've heard all year," Malcolm said. Eleanor nodded. Around them, several volunteers were dragging wooden sleds loaded with fishing nets toward the water's edge. Greyhaven's food reserves had survived the winter, but barely. Every new source of protein mattered now. "How many confirmed deaths?" Eleanor asked quietly. Malcolm knew the number without checking notes. 32. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. 32 people lost to cold, illness, violence, or accident during the long winter. In another era, that number would have shocked the town. Now it felt like survival. "We held together," Malcolm said. "Barely," Eleanor replied. She watched the volunteers cutting a narrow channel into the ice. Neighborhood councils are still arguing constantly. Malcolm smiled faintly. "That means they're working." Eleanor laughed softly. Perhaps he was right. Greyhaven was no longer governed solely from City Hall. Each district now had representatives coordinating labor crews, ration lines, and security patrols. It was slower, messier, but people felt ownership, and that had kept the town from collapsing inward during the worst weeks of winter. Malcolm pointed toward the southern road. "You're about to have new problems," he said. Eleanor followed his gaze. A wagon was approaching along the frozen road. Not refugees this time, messengers. Part 2. The First Delegation. The men who arrived that afternoon were from a settlement nearly 40 kilometers south, a farming village called Norbury, or what remained of it. Their leader introduced himself simply as Peter Wallace. His beard was thick with frost, and exhaustion carved deep lines around his eyes. "We heard Greyhaven survived the winter," he said. "That's a complicated word," Eleanor replied. Wallace nodded. "It always is." They sat together inside City Hall, where a small stove fought bravely against the lingering cold. Daniel Kowalczyk joined them, along with Malcolm and Councillor Mercer. Wallace didn't waste time.
Norbury's population was about 2,000 before the collapse, he said. After winter, maybe 1,200 remain. The room fell silent. Our tractors are dead, Wallace continued. Most of our irrigation equipment, too. You still have farmland, Daniel said. Yes, but without functioning machinery, planting season will be slow. Wallace leaned forward, and we heard Greyhaven has organized labor crews. Eleanor understood immediately. You want help. Wallace shook his head. We want partnership. Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Food in exchange for manpower, he said. Exactly. Mercer had been silent until now. What guarantees stability in Norbury? He asked. Wallace met his gaze calmly. Nothing. Mercer nodded slightly. Exactly. Eleanor frowned. What are you suggesting? Mercer folded his hands. Greyhaven is stable because we centralized critical functions. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Actually, we decentralize them. Mercer waved that aside. My point is, we have structure. He looked directly at Eleanor. If we begin sending resources to weaker settlements, their instability becomes our problem. Wallace's expression hardened slightly. We're not asking for charity. Mercer remained composed. I'm suggesting something more practical. The room grew quiet. Regional consolidation, Mercer said. Daniel blinked. You mean absorbing them? Yes. Wallace stared at him. You want to rule Norbury. Mercer shook his head. I want Greyhaven to control its security perimeter. Eleanor leaned back slowly. You're proposing expansion. I'm proposing stability. Part 3. Daniel's Numbers. Later that evening, Daniel stood beside Eleanor inside the warehouse that now served as Greyhaven's central food distribution center. Stacks of grain sacks lined the walls, barrels of preserved vegetables, crates of dried fish from the early lake harvest. It wasn't abundance, but it was something. You're thinking about Mercer's idea, Daniel said. I'm thinking about the consequences of every option. Daniel nodded. Good. He picked up a piece of chalk and began sketching rough numbers on a wooden crate. If we help Norbury plant crops this spring, he said, their harvest improves dramatically. He taps the crate. But here's the real opportunity. He drew a line connecting two imaginary towns. Trade routes. Eleanor watched him carefully. Controlled trade, Daniel continued. Taxed trade. Taxed? Yes. He smiled faintly. Civilization always taxes logistics. Eleanor folded her arms. You're proposing Greyhaven becomes a regional market hub. Daniel shrugged. If we're smart. And if we're not? Then Mercer's idea becomes attractive. Eleanor understood the implication. Control, expansion, authority. Daniel finished his diagram. Trade networks build influence, he said. Empires build enemies. Eleanor stared at the chalk lines. Trade meant cooperation. Mercer's approach meant power. Both could strengthen Greyhaven, but they would create very different futures. Part 4. The Proposal. The town hall meeting took place 3 days later. Nearly every resident of Greyhaven packed into the school gymnasium. The heating stove struggled against the cold air drifting through cracked windows. Candles burned low across makeshift tables. The atmosphere felt tense. People knew something important was being decided. Eleanor stepped forward first. We have received a request from the settlement of Norbury, she began. Murmurs moved through the crowd. They are proposing cooperation for the spring planting season. She explained the situation. Food exchange, shared labor,
mutual assistance. Then Mercer stepped forward. His voice carried easily across the room. Greyhaven has become one of the strongest communities in this region, he said. That strength is not accidental. He paused. It came from organization. People nodded. Norbury is unstable. Another pause. If we simply assist them, their problems will return to us later. He let the words settle. Instead, we should bring surrounding settlements under Greyhaven administration.
Gasps rippled through the gym. Shared law, shared security, shared food reserves. Mercer spread his hands. One structure. Eleanor stepped beside him. And one center of authority, she said. Mercer did not deny it. Yes. She turned to the crowd. I propose a different path. People leaned forward. Alliance, shared resources, mutual defense, but independent communities. She gestured across the room. Strength through cooperation. Mercer spoke quietly beside her. Cooperation fails when resources shrink. Eleanor met his gaze. Control fails when people stop believing in it. The room erupted into debate, and somewhere in that noise, the future of Greyhaven began to take shape. Part 5. The Long Debate. The argument lasted nearly 2 hours. Voices rose across the school gymnasium as lanterns flickered against the cold metal walls. People stood to speak one after another. Farmers, teachers, mechanics, refugees who had survived the winter inside Greyhaven's crowded shelters. Everyone understood the stakes. Greyhaven had survived collapse. What came next would determine whether it remained a town or became something larger. A tall man from the northern district stood first. If we help Norbury plant crops, we all eat better in the fall, he said. That seems simple. Murmurs of agreement followed. But another voice cut through the room. And what happens when the next town asks? A woman shouted from the back. And the one after that? She pointed toward the council table. We can't save everyone. Mercer stepped forward slightly. No, he said calmly. We cannot. Silence spread through the crowd. That is exactly why we need structure. If we bring surrounding settlements under Greyhaven governance, we control the distribution of labor and resources across the entire region. He gestured toward Eleanor. One coordinated system. A young refugee stood abruptly. Or one town ruling everyone else. The room tensed. Mercer did not react with anger. That depends entirely on how well we govern, he replied. Daniel leaned toward Eleanor and whispered quietly. He's winning some of them. She knew. People were tired. They had survived months of fear and scarcity. The promise of order, even strict order, sounded appealing. Finally, Eleanor stepped forward again. Greyhaven did not survive because one person made decisions for everyone, she said. It survived because thousands of people took responsibility for each other. She pointed toward the crowd. You cut wood. You hauled water. You organized shelters. You shared food. The gym grew quiet. If we dominate neighboring towns, she continued, they will obey us. A pause. But they will never trust us. Mercer folded his arms. Trust doesn't build irrigation systems. Eleanor met his gaze. No, she said, but trust builds alliances. The debate continued, back and forth, fear against hope, control against cooperation. And slowly, the town realized something unusual. There was no obvious right answer. Only different risks. Part 6. The Vote. Eventually, the arguments ran out.
Candles had burned low across the tables. Cold air drifted through the gymnasium doors every time someone stepped outside for breath. Finally, Malcolm stood and raised his voice. "It's time." The room quieted. Eleanor nodded. "This decision belongs to the town," she said, "not just the council." Hands would be raised, counted, simple, but the result would shape Greyhaven's future. Mercer spoke one last time. "Expansion does not mean oppression," he said calmly. "It means stability." He gestured toward the frozen landscape outside. "The world we lived in before is gone. No federal government, no provincial authority, no supply chains. If we do not organize this region ourselves, someone else will." He stepped back. Eleanor addressed the crowd. "My proposal is alliance, independent communities cooperating voluntarily, shared trade routes, shared defense, but no single town ruling the others." She paused. "This path is slower, harder, and less predictable." A faint smile touched her face. "But it allows people to remain free." The room fell silent. Malcolm began counting. "Those in favor of Mercer's consolidation plan?" Hands rose, many of them, more than Eleanor expected. He counted carefully, then lowered his notebook. "Those in favor of the alliance proposal?" More hands, but not dramatically more. Malcolm counted again. The tension inside the gym grew unbearable. Finally, he looked up. "Alliance passes." A long pause. "By 12 votes." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, roughly 52%, 48 against. It had been painfully close. People began filing out slowly into the cold night, some relieved, some disappointed, and some deeply uncertain. Eleanor remained standing near the front of the gym. The number echoed in her mind. 12 votes. Half the town had nearly chosen centralized authority, not because they loved power, because they feared collapse returning. That realization settled heavily in her chest. If things became worse, she might not win next time. Part 7. Quiet Words. Later that night, the gym stood nearly empty. Lanterns burned low. Snow fell softly outside. Eleanor gathered papers at the council table when footsteps approached. Mercer. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither spoke. "You won tonight," he said finally. Eleanor studied his expression. There was no bitterness there, no anger, just quiet conviction. "The town made its choice," she replied. Mercer nodded. "Yes." He looked toward the dark windows where snow drifted across the glass. "But winter isn't finished." The words lingered between them, not a threat, a reminder. He turned toward the door. "For what it's worth," he added, "I hope you're right." Then he left the gymnasium. Eleanor stood alone for several minutes. The vote had secured her vision, but it had also revealed something unsettling. Nearly half the town believed Mercer's approach was safer, and that belief would not disappear. It would wait, quietly, growing whenever fear returned. Part 8. The First Alliance. Spring arrived slowly. Ice broke apart across Lake Grey. Streams began flowing again through the forest. And for the first time since the collapse, Greyhaven sent organized expeditions beyond its immediate borders. Labor crews traveled south to Norbury. They repaired irrigation channels using hand tools, helped prepare fields for planting, and in return, Norbury sent wagon loads of preserved grain and livestock. Other settlements heard about the arrangement. A logging village 2 days east proposed timber trade. A fishing community along the northern lakes offered smoked fish in exchange for medical supplies. One by one, agreements formed. Not domination, not conquest, a network. Each town independent, but connected through shared survival. Daniel oversaw the creation of the first formal trade routes, marked by simple wooden signs along the forest roads. Greyhaven had become something unexpected, not the strongest settlement in the region, but the most connected, and connection was its own kind of power. Part 9. Ash and Iron. Months later, Eleanor stood on a hill overlooking the growing farmland south of Greyhaven. Fresh green shoots stretched across fields that had nearly been abandoned after the collapse. Malcolm joined her. "Norbury's planting schedule looks strong," he said. "Good." He nodded toward the distant road. 2 caravans arrived this morning. From where? West. Eleanor watched the horizon thoughtfully. More communities, more unknowns. Some would want trade. Some would want protection. Some might want control.
"Strange," Malcolm said. "What? A year ago, we were just trying to survive winter." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Now we're building something." He glanced at her. "You ever think Mercer might still be right about one thing?" "Which thing?" "That someone eventually tries to dominate this region." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Possibly," she said. "But when that day comes," she looked out across the connected towns and growing fields, "they won't face a single city. They'll face a network." Malcolm nodded slowly. And far beyond the horizon, in places Greyhaven had not yet seen, other powers were beginning to rise from the ashes of the old world. Some built with cooperation, others built with iron. The choices made in the months ahead would decide which future spread across the continent. For now, Greyhaven had chosen its path. Not empire, not submission, but alliance, and the fragile strength of small communities standing together. The age of survival was ending. The age of rebuilding had begun.
I'd like to ask for some feedback, if you would. Let me know in the comments if you are enjoying this series. Do you think society would rebuild in the independent alliance structure that Greyhaven is following, or lean more towards power structures? Subscribe, share, and hit that bell to be advised when the next thrilling City of Static audiobook is posted. This is Book 3 of a 5-book series. Book 4 will be coming out soon. Thank you for listening.